One of the things Carney says, for example, after he talks about the fact that 75% of our fossil fuel resources will have to be left in the ground, is this promised new magical utopia of renewable jobs, especially for places like Alberta. Now, he says that if we unleash innovation in the private sector, that all the problems that are associated with the transition to net zero will somehow be solved. So let's see what's happened in countries where that's actually being attempted. So I think we should talk about Germany and the UK. Well, one consequence is that German energy prices are now 5 times as expensive as they are in the US. And then you might say, well, that's a small price to pay for saving the planet, but then we could take that apart. So Germany is rapidly deindustrializing and their economy is tanking, and all the industrial production that they no longer manage is only shifting to other places in the world like China and India. So it's not like it's going away. It's just not happening in Germany. And they're increasingly dependent on renewables, solar and wind. And Germany is one of the world's sunniest countries, and it's also susceptible to what they call wind droughts. So there are long periods of time where the solar arrays and the windmills aren't producing any electricity. And like zero electricity is not very much electricity. Now, why is that a catastrophe? It's like, well, do you want your refrigerator on or off? And there are signs, for example, that places like Australia that have been moving down the renewable pathway are facing the imminent threat of rolling blackouts. And that could easily happen in places like Germany. Okay, so now the problem with renewables is that we can't store the energy. We don't have the battery technology and the battery infrastructure, not even close. And it's going to be a long time before we do, at least 20 years, maybe longer than that. And so the question is now, what do you have to do? Because renewable energy is so unreliable. Sometimes like at night, the sun doesn't shine, in case you hadn't noticed, and the wind stops blowing. And so then renewable production falls to zero. Now you have to have something to back that up. And worse, you have to have something of the same size as the entire renewable grid, because otherwise it can't handle the power demands. And so that means that as you switch to a renewable grid, you have to have another grid in place that has exactly the same capacities, and it has to be not renewable. So what that means is that when you build a renewable grid, you build it in addition to the pre-existing grid. And then you might say, well, if the renewable sources aren't producing energy, you could just turn to nuclear, but there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, you can't turn a nuclear power plant on and off quickly, as you might well imagine. And the Germans, for example, scuttled their nuclear plants. And so what have they done? They've turned to coal burning plants. And the Germans don't burn anthracite, which is high quality coal that doesn't produce much particulate matter, which is like the dust pollution that would be associated with smog. And they burn lignite, which is low quality coal, and it produces a lot of particulate, plus it produces a lot of carbon dioxide. And so what's happened in Germany after 10 years of green idiocy is that their power prices are 5 times as expensive. They're hyper-reliant on places like Russia and the Middle East for their fossil fuel production, not least because Canada was too daft to enter into an agreement with them. And they pollute more per unit of energy produced than they did 10 years ago. So even if you accept the environmentalist argument that carbon dioxide overproduction is an existential crisis, which it isn't, and you say, well, something substantial needs to be done to ameliorate the threat, you have to observe that when something substantial has been done, so that's the creation, let's say, of a renewable power grid, the consequence is not only that the atmosphere doesn't improve with regards to carbon dioxide proportion, but that the pollution problem actually gets much worse, as well as energy becoming more expensive and unreliable. And so what? That's what you want Carney to do for Canada. And for Canada, there's not a country in the world that's more dependent fundamentally for its existence on reliable energy, because Canada is uninhabitable without an unbelievably well-developed industrial and energy infrastructure. just to keep us alive when it's 40 bloody below. And then our economy is radically dependent on our natural resource production. Now, it shouldn't be that dependent on natural resource production because we should be doing value added investment. For example, refining our fossil fuel resources to a higher degree than we currently do. Most of that's done in the United States, and we should do things to ensure that we make the proper transition into a technologically driven future. But Carney says absolutely nothing about any of that in his book Values.